Hello, Internet. I'm Jackie Fox, and while I was reading up on everything for my video series on zombie capitalism, I was planning a video called The Death of Neoliberalism. And this was a theory that I had kind of come to myself that this era of politics was beginning to die. And I wanted to find other sources that kind of thought the same thing, see if I could enrich that perspective in that video. And what I ended up running into both kind of rewrote a lot of parts of that video series and my understanding of them, but has also changed my understanding of political history. And all of this comes from a book that I discovered, and I haven't read it yet. I haven't purchased it yet. I'm waiting for my Patreon funds to build up to where I can afford to get that purchased and read it for the channel. But I have watched a number of extensive interviews with the author, Gary Gerstle, who is a professor of American history at Cambridge University. And I think in viewing politics through his perspective, I was able to see a bias in my own perspective. And that's why this is the first video, just explaining kind of his perspective on politics and political history especially. And the way it can break us out of kind of our ingrown cycles, which may even result from our own limited lived experiences. Now, the bias that I have identified here in myself and within our culture is something that I would refer to as neoliberal realism. In fact, this actually, in some ways, I mean to call out to capitalist realism and the ideas that Mark Fisher put forward, but mainly the ideas that pertained specifically to neoliberalism, like the idea that this was the end of history. This is much more of a characteristic of neoliberalism than it is of capitalism itself. And I think that this is one of the bigger factors in this particular type of bias. So for people who might be, say, 20 to 40, people who are young enough to, or who are just old enough to not be idealistic about the world anymore, entering your 20s, and people who are just old enough to not really have a bunch of lived experience in at least the height of the New Deal era of politics. And because of that, because of our lived experiences, we have lived all our lives, or all of our political, or especially all of our adult lives, within the neoliberal order. And this has been an order where essentially, and despite how it might seem sometimes, the opposition party has been the Democratic Party, the trend-setting party, the party that establishes the general bounds of the political discussion has largely been the Republican Party. You know, you don't hear Republicans talking about going too far right, but you hear Democrats talking about going too far left and actively trying to chase the center, which is largely, you know, the legacy of the Clinton presidency, that liberals think this way, that liberals think that, you know, that the liberals that we have really aren't liberals, they're neoliberals. You know, you either have more left neoliberals or more right neoliberals, but they all really kind of conform to this singular philosophy to which there is no alternative within American politics, or there is a very, very small alternative that hasn't yet met a lot of electoral success. I mean, there have been cases on either side of non-neoliberal ideologies gaining a little bit of a foothold. Some of them progressive, some of them pretty much fascist. And I think this is a sign, in addition to everything that I presented in the previous videos on zombie capitalism, that this order of politics has failed and has died. And it's just for politicians to both realize how to, more specifically, how to capitalize on this to gain more electoral power by following a yet unknown or yet undefined political strategy that will forge the next few decades of American political history. And the part of Gary's work that leads me to this is his identification of political orders. And a political order is basically, it's not that there is any necessarily it's not that there's like a law. It's not that there are any restrictions. It's really about kind of unwritten rules that are established and that people think, this is the line that I can't cross and remain in politics. If I cross this line, then I lose my position. And where those lines are in the political discourse is largely defined by the political order. For instance, in talking about the New Deal political order that existed from from Franklin Delano Roosevelt being elected and moving into New Deal politics, which cemented a period of time where Democrats won 5 consecutive elections. It seemed like without bowing to New Deal politics, Republicans would have no way of winning. And therefore, the lines were set on what was politically acceptable and the order was established. And it worked until it didn't work in the 1970s in numerous ways and started to fall apart. And then we get Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan comes in with a popular new ideology. And I think that the next 2 presidents are perhaps even more crucial in establishing this as the status quo and not a blip on the radar. But George H.W. Bush, while he was another Republican, which means that, the Republicans have run a pretty good streak up to this point to lead Democrats in the same way that Republicans made the same decision in the New Deal era, to lead Democrats to believe that adopting some of these Republican Reagan strategies are really the only way to move forward and to be electable. Which is what leads us into Bill Clinton. But the thing that really cemented that idea was the fact that George H.W. Bush was pretty against Reaganomics. He was maybe more akin to a New Deal Republican, or he still hadn't quite moved out of that mindset. So he presented an alternative to the Republican Party. That alternative managed to win, but famously, he was a one-term president. He got beat in his next election by Bill Clinton, and usually incumbents don't lose. So this suggested that the previous strategy for the Republican Party of Reaganism was successful with the people, and that trying to run as a Republican, and not adopt that strategy was not a long-term successful strategy. And this also, the fact that they had won these elections consecutively led someone like Bill Clinton to solidify the left bound of how far left you could go and still win. And, if you think of Bill Clinton in the way that he acted, which was much more like a Republican, or much more like the Republicans before him acted, you'll see that we had a similar because then George Bush comes next. So 28-year period of pretty much Republican rulership that cemented the neoliberal order. And, even Obama couldn't get himself entirely out of this. He may have campaigned like he wasn't necessarily a neoliberal, but he ended up really hitting all of the core tenets along the way and just being a more left than, the rest of the neoliberal order, but still very much within the bounds of what the neoliberal conversation was. But starting in 2016, that started falling apart. I mean, there had already been signs of this, that Barack Obama, who at least, again, didn't campaign like a neoliberal, at least initially, was able to beat Hillary Clinton, who was pretty much, as the woman in the White House while Bill Clinton was president for 8 years, and also a woman with with an extensive political career after that herself, in which she was very neoliberal and, falling from that neoliberal heritage that her husband had. It's symbolically, at the very least, even if she may be a little bit more progressive than Bill Clinton, symbolically people really connected her to him and to the neoliberal order through that. And I think that one of the first signs that this order was starting to fall was the fact that look at America's history and tell me, just imagine yourself in 2007 and tell me who you think is going to be president, a white woman or a black man. Now, there's arguments that both of both of them, for different reasons, face particular hurdles towards becoming the president of the United States. But personally, I probably think that we would get a white woman before a black man. That's just what I would have assumed. So the fact that America kind of stepped past that and still elected a black man over this caricature of the status quo really shows that we don't appreciate the status quo. And then there was, political turmoil through that period related to the crash of 2008, in which it became more apparent that more people weren't in favor of the political status quo. And you even see within the ruling party, the Republicans, you see movements like the Tea Party and all of these things that are telling them to think outside of the bounds of their own neoliberal order. So even on the right, it is increasingly becoming a losing strategy to be a status quo neoliberal politician, which leads us perfectly into 2016, where we have a just brazen idiot take the whole Republican primary by storm, just by, being willing to question some tenets of the neoliberal order. And there are some ways in which Donald Trump continued the policy of the neoliberal era, but there are other ways, such as his stark opposition to loosened immigration, more neoliberal, globalized immigration strategies, but also the trade partnerships that had really been such a big facet of the neoliberal order, starting with the ones put in place by Clinton. But he specifically took out the TPP, TPP. He specifically took out the TPP, which had been put in place by Obama. And while talking shit about the rest of them as well, and this had been something that you couldn't really do, Gary Gerstle himself places this type of policy as one of the 4 core pillars of neoliberal political ideology. So the fact that he was able to go against that, and that was one of the things that people liked him for the most, really symbolizes that even in the ruling party of the neoliberal era, the Republicans, the traditional Republican ideas just weren't working anymore. Otherwise, this wouldn't have been possible. And then even further to pit both sides against each other. And, Hillary had her problems winning. I still think that she kind of rigged the election in her favor, the primary in her favor, in the way that she used superdelegates, such that the Democratic Party had to change their primary rules because of what they got caught doing. And, just brief summary of that, you have delegates and superdelegates. You have a certain amount of superdelegates per state. And they don't have to vote with their state. They can vote for whoever they want. And typically these are Democratic Party officials or big donors that get picked for these. So they tend to pick very much among what the party really wants, which is to conform to the political order, which is to pick the most neoliberal Democrats that they can find. So, halfway through the primary, things are pretty neck and neck between her and Bernie, and boom, she calls in all the superdelegates from states that haven't voted yet, and it looks like overnight she has a landslide of popularity. But really, it was just her calling on party officials in places that hadn't voted yet. And really, the media didn't make a big enough deal about how this wasn't proportionate, how this didn't necessarily represent the people's will, but the idea got out there that she was whooping his ass, and he didn't really last much longer in the primary after that, because it felt like he had already lost, even though the votes that he was drowning in, that were coming in for Hillary, were from states that hadn't even voted yet, just saying. But even with that, the idea of someone like Bernie Sanders being able to topple the neoliberal queen of the Democratic Party, Hillary Clinton, the fact that he even came close, the fact that she had to resort to such measures to win, really says a lot about her popularity among Democrats. And then when she couldn't beat this raving madman that we all had legitimate reasons to be scared of, that pretty much showed that the whole country was more or less in favor of anything but neoliberalism. And when you add this to the increasing crises that we've seen since, especially related to the pandemic, our complete inability to deal with such a thing because of because of healthcare being a political third rail due to the neoliberal order, as long as you're not as long as you're not talking about privatizing it. If you're talking about privatizing it, that's well within the bounds of the conversation. But actually giving it to people, letting people be able to use it, no, not really. And the idea of political orders additionally helps me clarify American history, American political history in a way that things just felt out of place before. Like, Richard Nixon is such a good example of this because he did a lot of Richard Nixon things. He was a pretty horrible person, as a lot of presidents are, especially a lot of Republican presidents, no matter what order they happen to be a part of. But because he was a member of the New Deal political order, he did things like assuring that if something happened to your kidneys as an American, you would not have to pay to have yourself taken care of, specifically for your kidneys. We have Medicare for all for kidneys in America because of Richard Nixon. And I know this because the government paid millions of dollars in bills for my father while he was going through kidney failure. 4 years. We paid nearly nothing to be able to do that. And that wasn't because of insurance or anything. It was purely because of Richard Nixon, which is kind of wild to acknowledge that my family owes him, and that many families probably owe him that debt, and many people owe him years of their life for that decision. And additionally, I think we all owe him a bit for the EPA, even though it has been kind of ineffective since it was put in place, because Richard Nixon was on the tail end of the New Deal era, and we almost immediately got to a complete reversal of the whole party's position on the environment with Reaganism, who was famously very much against the EPA. He doesn't make any sense. He seems like a basket of contradictions. But if you look at him as being one part, or maybe even two parts, party ideology, and one part being the political order, which is a bit incongruent with Republican ideology, then it makes sense why he is that way. And the same is true for Bill Clinton. I mean, if you took him outside of his place in political history and just put him on a chart, he would definitely be in line with most of the Republicans. He would not be really in the same ballpark as many Democrats that we've had. And yet, he was the first Democratic president of my lifetime, which set and I think this is a big part of, especially why there's a bunch of neoliberal realism within my generation on the left, because our first introduction to the left side of the American political system was Bill Clinton, who was just selling us the fuck out the whole time he was in office. So naturally, we have a lot of cynicism, especially towards Democrats. But historically, while all American parties that have been successful have been capitalist in the past, the one that comes closest to real leftist change has always been the Democratic Party. Now, they've been basically kneecapped by the political order through the entire neoliberal era, and the kind of shady, typical Democratic politicians that we have had through this era have been utterly complicit pieces of shit, but that doesn't mean that they have to be moving into the future, especially where we are right now. And furthermore, because we are at this changing of times, both sides are looking for an ideology that can take over the mainstream right now. So basically, the winner of this political ideology battle that has been happening is effectively going to dictate the behavior of both parties for the next couple of decades. And it is kind of scary that the one of those that has the most traditional infrastructure for building up its own political order is the fascist side of things with Trumpism. We haven't had a real serious victory in that same way that electing Donald Trump and many of the other stooges that he got into office since introducing America to Trumpism, that hasn't necessarily been reflected on the left as much. Although there are a lot of hopeful and optimistic reasons why the next political order may be a further left one. I mean, first of all, because America tends to bounce back and forth. Progressive era, regressive era, progressive era. That just kind of makes sense. Independent of what has happened super recently, there has been quite a trend of progressives and increasingly progressive people getting a lot of electoral support outside of, the presidency on the Democratic side. And I would say that this wave is kind of similar to the wave of Trump sycophants that we've seen come in. So, we're behind by a presidency and probably a lot of think tanks and that kind of bullshit. But when you also consider, I mean, there have been a number of like protest movements and movements that have shown that Trumpism is able to get people out and in action. Being just weird shit like the trucker convoy that happened in America, or attempted coups. You know, it does show that it can mobilize passionate people. But on the left, we have the kind of the same thing. Not that we tried to coup anything other than our local workplaces by instituting unionization. And this is a really similar event to that same type of, you know, realism breaking perspective. Because a couple of years ago, I wouldn't have believed that we would have so many unionized Starbucks. Hold on. Back up. I'm getting a little too optimistic here. I wouldn't believe that we have this many Starbucks locations that have won their union votes. They have not necessarily become unionized yet because Starbucks is a shit company that is fighting this in every legal and illegal means that they can. But I did make a video when the first Amazons were talking about unionization, when the first Starbucks was talking about unionization, and I said that all they need to do is win one of these battles, no matter where, as long as it's with a big company like this, or like Walmart would have been really impactful too. If you see a big chain, people all over the country are going to hear that news and go, well, why not my location? It's going to create a wave. This is why I think especially that the left needs to do things that actually impact people. Because when we hit big targets like this, when we get publicity for unionizing a Starbucks like this, all of the other Starbucks will want to jump in on that. You know, and in that way, something that seemed impossible in 2019, something that still kind of seemed impossible when I was making that video about it. I felt like it was a very hopeful take that one of these could get it and then that we would have a wave. It did not feel like a certainty when I was making that video. But in retrospect, that absolutely is what happened. And I was right. Cool, go me. But I think that this same sort of things being impossible until they're possible is something that we're kind of encountering in politics right now. And I think that should we push that? Should we pull at that thread enough? Should we provide enough solutions? Should we have enough organizational power outside of politics that can endorse progressive candidates that actually have a plan for changing things in their local areas? If we can affect that kind of change, then I think that we have a chance of winning the political order for ourselves. You know, because as much as I hate to admit this, you know, at least with the fervency and the electoral resolve that is required for a political order, the left is really losing to fascism right now. And it's not an exciting thing to watch, you guys. And I think that a big part of the reason why we are losing that battle, and I think that a big part of the reason why we're losing that battle electorally is neoliberal realism. For the right-wing folks, you know, that are playing on their home turf, they have every reason to want to vote. But people on the left who are choosing the lesser of two evils because we are in an evil order, or who are used to that, because we were in an evil order, are now feeling so disenfranchised that they aren't lending their support to more progressive things that are happening around the periphery. And, you know, we still haven't really gotten a progressive president yet, unfortunately. In a later video in this series, I will talk about pushing Biden to... I don't think he can be pushed to be that president, but I think he can be pushed to the left of where the neoliberal bound for the left is. And if he becomes more successful after crossing that line, then it opens the door for someone to outflank him on the left over here and really establish a new functional political order. And I gotta say, I didn't like the idea of, hey, vote Biden in the primary. We can push him left. I thought that was kind of bullshit. I mean, why push him when you've got Bernie running? This just seems like a stupid strategy. But Bernie lost. He made his concession to get certain things added into the Biden agenda. One of those, I think one of the most stark that he agreed on, that he had previously been very much against, was canceling some level of student debt. Now, Bernie wanted him to cancel it all, and he still hasn't done that. But this is a platform position, this newest thing that he did, that he picked up directly from Bernie because Bernie dropped out and used that for negotiating power and leverage. The thing that we're getting is because of their collaboration, and it seems to be incredibly popular for him. So, we've still got over half of his presidency left. What if, seeing that this is the thing that makes him popular, what if, seeing that this is the thing that helps Democrats win midterms, he realizes, well, for this next 2 years, I've got to really listen to Bernie. I mean, both parties are in uncertain times, and fascism seems to be the only thing that is really establishing itself and rooting into electoral politics right now to replace the current dying order. But we do have potential to push the momentum the other way. And crucially, this comes not only from electoral politics, but also from that outside of it. There is, in relation to the New Deal political order, Gary Gerstle talks about how it was very important that there was an active, large communist country at that time, because it did put some pressure on the United States to adopt more progressive strategies to prevent us from having a communist revolution. And as long as that existed in the world, it gave the workers of the world, but America specifically in this case, more leverage to get what they wanted and needed for that time. And that a big part of the reason that the neoliberal order was allowed to establish itself and the left didn't ever come up with a good counterpoint was that we lost that leverage. And now we are approaching a moment where we are fostering a movement outside of electoral politics towards unionization, towards leftist thought, and we need to capitalize on that electorally as well. But it is important that we build both sides of that equation. We should not abandon all of that effort, because it is probably the most important thing in play here, I think. So say we have a big Starbucks union. How impactful would it be if they threw their support behind a presidential candidate? Maybe not a status quo presidential candidate, or maybe if they supported local politicians in their area. Maybe if they got behind a particular congressman that adopted maybe a strategy of labor rights. If those two sides of this political coin work together, then maybe we can establish something that can demonstrate to people that we can have a better future. Because if we believe that, as sick as we are of the current system across the board, I think that we're going to have a winning proposition on our hands. So my next probably 2 videos are going to be discussing that. Catch you there. And I'll drop links to at least maybe 4 or 5 of the hour-long conversations I've seen with Gary. And they let him talk. This man has a wealth of information. So I'm not saying it's the same as reading the book. That's why I still want to buy the book and find out for myself and get a deeper understanding of some of these things, as well as learning tidbits about American political history. But yeah, it's worth a watch if you thought this idea was interesting, or if it helped you think about American politics more easily than in the 4 to 6 year cycles that we tend to think about them in now. And if you'd like to support the channel, I'll put links on the screen right now to ways that you can donate to support the channel, help me buy books like The Rise and Fall of Neoliberalism, or just other things that would benefit the channel. Thank you. See you in the next one.